God has been very, very good to you. Amen. I am grateful for the things that you have done. Yes, I'm grateful for the victories we won. I could go on and on and on about your word, because I'm grateful, grateful, so grateful just to praise you, Lord. Flowing from my heart are the issues of my heart is gratefulness. I am grateful for the things that you have done. Yes, I'm grateful for the victories we won. I could go on and on and on about your words, because I'm grateful, grateful, so grateful just to praise you. Flowing from my heart are the issues of my heart is gratefulness. Grateful, 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 grateful,
Time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. I tell you the truth, when you were young, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." Now I want you to hear it from the Passion Translation. And it reads, after they had breakfast, Jesus said to Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you burn with love for me more than these?" Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I have great affection for you." "Then take care of my lambs," Jesus said. Jesus repeated the same question the second time. "Simon, son of John, do you burn with love for me?" Peter answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I have great affection for you." "Then take care of my sheep," Jesus said. Then Jesus asked him again, "Peter, son of John, do you have great affection for me?" Peter was saddened by being asked the third time and said, "My Lord, you know everything. You know that I burn with love for you." Jesus replied, "Then feed my lambs." Peter, listen. When you are younger, you made your own choices and you went where you pleased. But one day when you are old, others will tie you up and escort you where you have not chosen to go. And you will spread out your arms. Jesus said this to Peter as a prophecy of what kind of death he would die for the glory of God. And then he said to Peter, "Follow me." Let us pray. Father God, I come before you right now, Lord God, to give you glory, to give you honor, and to give you praise. Father, I come before you right now, Lord God, just needing you. Needing you, God, in this preaching moment. Lord, you are a great God and you are an awesome God. Father, we come before you on this Father's Day, acknowledging that you are our Father, our great Father. Father, I come now as it is time to minister the word that you've given me, Lord God. Now, God, I need you to put all the pieces together, Lord God. Father, I need you to sit Valerie down, and I need you to allow your spirit to stand up in her. Now, God, have your way. Father, there are others here who are struggling on this day. And Father, we're asking, God, that you would be the great comforter that you always are. So now, God, have your way. Father, I pray that someone will hear a sentence, a paragraph, a word that they need to hold on. A little while longer. So now, God, have your way. We love you, we adore you, and we praise you. It's in the precious and the great name of Jesus Christ. Amen. sudden, I just can feel my Father's Spirit.
All right.
This morning, I want to minister from the theme, restored. Restored. Look at somebody and say, restored.
Restored.
Restored. Restored. For the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about Simon. We've been talking about Peter. I am intrigued by Peter because I believe he is so much like you and I. Peter is so very flawed, but yet he's so very faithful. And God used him in an extra special way. We all acknowledged a couple of weeks ago that we are not perfect either. That we are all flawed individuals. It's so easy in life to focus on our flaws. It's easy to focus on our disappointments. It's easy to focus on the failures. It's easy to focus on every single little flaw that we have. And sometimes we spend so much time focusing on our flaws that we miss the great things that God has in store for us. Sometimes, my brothers and sisters, we get stuck in a place that is so far from where God has us because we can't see past our flaws. We can't see past our mistakes. We can't see past our shortcomings and we can't see beyond our failures. Failures can be devastating. I don't know about you, but I hate to fail. I hate failure. I take failure to heart. It feels like a heartbreak. I can only remember, Nikki, one time in school when I actually failed a test. That's through all 12, 13, including kindergarten. I never failed a test except for one time. Now, I didn't always ace a test. Didn't mean I got an A or a B. Sometimes there were those borderline C's. But the one time I saw an F on my paper, I was devastated. I can see that F on my paper in my mind still, because it was in red and it was circled. That F. I was devastated and I was angry. I was angry at me. Now, I do remember failing the CPA exam, and I was so close. And again, I was angry and devastated. Angry enough to throw some things around the room because I felt that I had studied very, very hard, but yet I still failed that test. But it is not always a test in school that causes us to experience failure. For me, I've had 2 failed marriages. In my book, Failures, that I take to heart. How about you? Do you have any failures in your life? Perhaps a marriage, maybe a relationship or 2. How about a failed job? Or maybe you just failed with money. How about as parenting? Maybe even you have failed as a Christian, or you feel as if you have failed as a Christian. Can anybody agree with me that this morning that failure is hard? Failure can keep us from being who we were created to be. Can I show you or tell you what I mean this morning? Does anybody know who Simba is? Everybody knows who Simba is. From the Lion King, Simba. You know the story, but I want to take you back to one of the scenes from the movie. And the scene has a name, and it's called Remember Who You Are. You see, in the scene, you see Simba's dad, Mufasa. Now, the king had already died and was actually murdered, but young Simba doesn't know that. And he believes that he is actually the cause of his father's death. So he flees into the woods, feeling shame and guilt, and feeling like a complete failure. So he vows that he's never going to go back home to face those people, to face his family. So he stays in the jungle and he meets some friends. You know their friend's name?
Pumbaa and Timon.
Timon and Pumbaa. Yes, you're right. And he stays there in the jungle with them, and he grows up into a full lion, having a good life, enjoying life in the jungle. Now, the life was not bad, but he was not doing what he was created to do. It wasn't until Nala showed up and tells him to come home and be the king that he is. That's when he starts to wrestle with his past and his failure. Mufasa, his father, reminds him in a sort of supernatural encounter that he must remember who he is. Remember who you are. He tells him, Mufasa tells him, there's a king in you, and it's time. Simba realizes that it's time to face his past. That he can no longer live in the wilderness, but it was time to be restored to his rightful place as king. It is time to stop hiding, because God has placed within you, and it is time to take your place for the assignment that God is calling you to. God told me to tell somebody this morning that it's time to stop hiding in the jungle. And it's time to take your place. You see, Jesus restored Peter back to his rightful position. And you know what? He will do the same for you. Well, how does this story relate to Peter? Let me show you. You see, we left Peter last week. He had been given blessings, a new name, and a promise of a new job. You remember that, right? But since then, a lot has happened. Some of the things that have happened, Peter has been rebuked by Jesus. Peter, along with James and John, witnessed the transfiguration of Jesus and the appearance of Moses and Elijah on the mountaintop. Peter saw all of that. Jesus made a prediction that Peter would deny him 3 times before the rooster crows. Peter and the other disciples, some of the other disciples, fell asleep while Jesus was praying in the garden. When Jesus was arrested by the betrayal of Judas, Peter takes his sword out and cuts off the ear of the servant. You see, a lot has happened since last week. The prediction of Jesus comes true when Peter denies him not once, not twice, but 3 times. What else has happened? Peter and the other apostles receive word from Mary Magdalene that the body of Jesus is no longer there in the tomb. Peter rushes to Jesus' tomb to confirm the news. Jesus appears to Peter before appearing to the other disciples. Jesus appears in front of all the 11 disciples, and now with all of that behind them, Peter has gone fishing. All of that happened. All of the things that I just listed for you has happened. And with all of that, now Peter has gone back fishing. Now remember, last week, Peter got it right. You recall that, right? Peter got it right. And he proclaimed Jesus to be the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But this week, Peter is wallowing in his failure. Peter said, Jesus, I will die for you. But Jesus said, as a matter of fact, no, you won't. Before the rooster crows in the morning, you will say 3 times that you don't even know me. And it happened just the way that Jesus predicted. Now, we don't know where Peter was, Kimmy, when Jesus was crucified. The Bible doesn't tell us that. We don't know if he was in the distance watching. We don't know if he was hiding somewhere. All we know for sure is that Peter was not present and that he had denied knowing him. But today, what we do know is that we find Peter fishing. We find Peter fishing. And Jesus calls out to them. Now, if you remember the week before last, the first week we met Peter and Jesus, what were they doing? They were fishing. They were fishing. The scene that I read to you today is very similar to the scene from the very first time we talked about Peter. If you read those verses 1 through 14, you will see that Peter was fishing. You see, Peter tried to go back to what he knew. He went back to his comfort zone. But guess who shows up while he's trying to go back to his comfort zone? And it's almost the exact same scenario. Peter and the boys are fishing, and they are not catching anything. And Jesus calls out, cast your net on the other side. And they do that, and they catch a lot of fish again. The same way that it happened the first time. And John says that, and John, the Bible says that it was John who said, it's Jesus. And once John says that, Peter jumps into the water and swims toward his master. Now, this is really the first encounter that Peter and Jesus have had to talk. There has been no conversation at all about what happened. No conversation about the denial. Now, I need you to put on your spiritual imagination hat, and I want you to imagine what it was like sitting there around that fire with all the other disciples, with Peter there, knowing what had happened, knowing that nobody has said anything to Peter about it. They probably had conversation amongst themselves, but now Jesus is present. I would imagine that the mood was probably so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Right.
Who's going to start the conversation? It's like one of those dinners where nobody is talking, but there is an elephant in the room. And then Jesus starts to talk. And he starts to question Peter. Now remember, this conversation is happening with all the other disciples around. Now, imagine that your name is Peter. Imagine that your name is Simon. And all of a sudden, Jesus turns to you and doesn't call you Peter right now. Doesn't call you the name that he gave you, but he calls him his old name. He says, Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Now, the first thing that I want you to note is that Jesus calls Peter by his old name. Every once in a while, Jesus needs to remind us that you still got some of those old ways in you. Sometimes we like to pretend that even though we are a new creation, even though God has made us brand new, but sometimes we like to pretend that some of those old ways don't surface. But can we be honest in the house today and say that every once in a while, all of those old ways do try and surface? I don't care what you have overcome. Every once in a while, that thing gonna creep right back up on you. Now, it doesn't mean that you have to acknowledge it, but it's still going to be there. So Jesus calls him Simon. He says, not Peter, not the new name, but Simon, son of John, do you truly love me more than these? Now, let's look first at the word love, because Jesus is using the word for love, agape. And that's the ultimate love. That's the unconditional love. He is saying, do you truly love me with an unconditional love more than these? Now, what these are, of course, the commentators say a lot of things, or, well, several things I'll say. It could be that Jesus was asking Peter, do you love me more than these fish? What does the fish represent? It represents our livelihood. It represents that thing that has our focus. It represents that thing that has the potential to pull us away from Jesus. Do you truly love me more than these? More than that job that you have? More than this or more than that? It is something that you are also into. More than these. Or he could have been saying, do you love me more than these disciples? If you remember the conversation, Peter said, I love you, Jesus, more than all these other guys. I love you more than they do. But Peter was the one who denied him 3 times. So Peter responds. He said, you know that I love you. But the word that he uses for love is phileo. What that means is I like you. It means I'm fond of you. So Jesus is saying, do you love me with an unconditional love? And Peter's response is, I like you. I'm fond of you. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't know if I could have said, I agape you. I love you, Jesus, with an unconditional love. Because to say that probably meant that I would not have denied you those 3 times. Peter's response is, I'm fond of you, Jesus. Now, how many of you have ever been in love? Raise your hand if you've been in love before. Okay. I think all the hands are up in the room. How do you feel when you tell somebody, I love you? I mean, you just going all out. I love you. And they say to you, yeah, you cool. I like you. I'm fond of you. Absolutely. That is not a good feeling. It is not a good, but that's what's going on right here. That's the kind of feeling of love. That's the difference in the love. So Jesus asked him a second time. He said, do you truly love me? And he uses the same word for love. He uses the agape love. Do you love me unconditionally? And Peter has the same response. He says, Jesus, I'm fond of you. I'm fond of you. Now, each time Jesus tells him, first he tells him, tend to my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. The second time he says, take care of my sheep. Now, get this in your mind. Jesus is asking Peter, do you truly love me? Agape me. Peter says, I'm fond of you. But yet Jesus still says, feed my sheep. The second time he says, do you truly love me? Do you agape me? Peter says, I'm fond of you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Now the third time he asked him again, do you truly love me? But this time he uses the same word for love that Peter used. So he's saying, Jesus is now saying, do you phileo me? Now, this time, Peter is crushed, the Bible says. Because in his mind, with that third question, you know what it took him back to? It took him right back to being around that charcoal fire where he denied him 3 times. Maybe the first 2 times, get away. But the third time, he heard that rooster crowing in his mind. You see, the rooster was a trigger for Peter to take him back to that failure, that place of failure. So in this encounter, what Jesus is doing is he's taking him back to that place of failure. By asking him 3 times, do you love me? Now, let me show you a couple of things. There's so much that we can pull from this text. But first of all, Jesus focuses on Peter's capacity to love and not his failure. He doesn't focus on his failure. Not once did Jesus scold Peter or say, I told you you were going to do that. He didn't even say, Peter, you failed me. He didn't fuss at Peter. He didn't say, I told you so. He didn't revisit that encounter in a way that went word for word of what happened to Peter. But he did have to make Peter face his failure. You see, we cannot move forward in our future unless we face our failure. And what Jesus did was take Peter back to that place to say, yeah, Peter, I know, you know, we don't have to talk about it, but we both know that you failed in that place. But now I'm bringing you back to a place of restoration. You see, I'm not focusing on your failure, but I'm focusing on your capacity to love. I'm asking you, do you love me? I'm telling you, I'm commanding you to take care of my sheep. Now, the question I had to ask is, how did this failure get Peter such an important job? I mean, think about that. I read to you everything, or some of the things that happened to Peter, and it had much failure in it. But yet, you have this man who made mistake after mistake after mistake, and he gets the job. He gets the command to feed my sheep, to take care of my sheep. So, Florence, I want to know, how did this big failure, how did this man with a big F over his life, circled in red, how is it that Jesus sat with him and gave him one of the most important jobs? I want to know, Peter, what qualifies you to be called to feed the Lord's sheep? You see, Jesus knows all of our shortcomings. He knows all of our failures, all of our mistakes, all of our denials, and he still loves you unconditionally, especially you. Can I take you back a few chapters where Jesus had risen from the dead, and Jesus was commanding or telling the women to go and tell the disciples what you've seen. And you know what he said? Especially Peter. He said, especially tell Peter, because he knew that Peter was in a place of brokenness. He knew that Peter was in this place where he was wrestling with his failure and trying to figure out, what am I going to do? I denied my master, my savior, not once, not twice, but 3 times. He says, especially Peter. Can I tell you that Peter had to deal with his own stuff before he could deal with anybody else's stuff? You see, Jesus had to put his failure in front of him so that he could deal with his own stuff. It was only then that he could go forward and do the assignment that God has given him. I've come to tell somebody this morning that you've got to deal with your own stuff before you can effectively do the assignment that God is calling you to do. You see, God has to put some stuff right in front of you, and you got to reconcile your heart, spirit, and soul with it and be able to move on, because if not, everybody else who comes in front of you with that very same issue, you're going to put them on their own cross. You are going to whip them up one street and down the other, because you have not assignment that you have been called to do. Maybe you're wondering why things are not working the way you want them to. Perhaps one of the questions you have to ask yourself is, there some stuff in me that I gotta deal with? Do I need to take a look in the mirror and deal with this stuff so that I will know how to deal with other people when they come across my pathway? You see, we are called to share and to do our assignment, not because we are perfect, but because the Lord sees beyond our failures. Now, the other thing I want you to see in this text is also about forgiveness. It is about forgiveness. We must be prepared to forgive without limits. But also, we must be ready to ask for forgiveness and then believe that you are forgiven. Forgiveness is one of the hardest things ever. You see, Peter had not forgiven himself for what he did, but Jesus had to help him say and see that he was indeed forgiven. Jesus helped Peter to face his failure. Now, it was at this point that Jesus restored Peter back to his rightful position. You see, Peter couldn't just go fishing because he had an assignment to do. He could not stay out there in the boat and just fish because there were people to be ministered to. There were people to be saved. There were people to talk to. So Jesus came to restore Peter so that Peter could do the assignment that he was called to do. I've come to let somebody know this morning that Jesus is still in the restoration business. He still wants to restore you back to that rightful position so that you can move forward and do the assignment that God has called you to do. You see, we've all got some stuff that we've got to deal with before we can do what it is that God is calling us to do. And it's not just a one-time thing. I believe as He takes us from level to level, we all have some things that we have to deal with. But I am so glad, my brothers and sisters, that Jesus can use a man like Peter, because it means if He can use a man like Peter, He can use a woman like me. It means He can use a man like you. It means that He can use all of us to do the assignment. You see, Jesus didn't go out looking for the perfect man. It was actually the exact opposite. It was a man of mistakes, of failure, a man who said any and everything, but yet He said, feed my sheep. He said, take care of my sheep. And you know, that still wasn't the last mistake that Peter made, because if you keep reading your Bible, you'll see that Paul had to admonish Peter because Peter didn't want to eat with the Gentiles. And Paul was like, no, wait a minute. Don't forget where you came from. You see, he was still making mistakes. But yet that's the man that Jesus chose to feed his sheep. I don't know about you, but that's encouraging to me, because I know that I have failed in some areas. I know that I have made some mistakes. Is there anybody in the house who can be honest enough to say that you've made some mistakes, that you've done some things as well? But but yet you are still qualified to do the assignment that God has called you to do. And He's calling you to do your assignment. So from this day forward, I need you to move forward with your head up. I need you to deal with your past, deal with your failures, whatever it is, and know that you still have an assignment that Jesus is still calling you to do. You don't have to hang your head and say, I can't do this. I'm not good enough. I've come to tell you this morning that you have been restored, that you do have an assignment that you must do. I need everybody in the house to know that you are qualified. Look at somebody and say, I'm qualified. I'm qualified. I need you to look at somebody else and say, I am qualified to do the work that God has called me to do. Now tell them, I'm not perfect. I'm not perfect. I made some mistakes. But it is through those mistakes that God has grown me and taught me and will use me through everything that I've gone through. I need you to put your hands together and give God some praise. I want to give God some praise this morning. I hope that through these 3 sermons, you can see that Peter was definitely flawed, but yet he was faithful. He was so faithful. There is another man in the Bible, his story ended up different. Judas's story is so different. He could not face and did not face his failure. He didn't think that Jesus could forgive him for betrayal. But yet, Peter knew that he was the Son of God. He knew that he was the Messiah. But he also knew that he messed up. And when we mess up, where do we go? We go to the Son of the living God. We go to the Messiah and say, I messed up. I'm loving you the best that I can, Jesus, but I still messed up. You know, and I told you last week that Jesus meets us where we are. But even in love, Reverend Gwen, because notice he started out with, do you agape me? Do you agape me? And then he finally said, do you phileo me? He met Peter where he was. Where he was. Peter was unable to say, I agape you. So Jesus said, do you phileo me? He met him where he was in every aspect of his life. Every aspect. And he'll do the same for you. So that you can do the assignment that you've been called to do.